A black man saves an elderly woman from a fire. One day later, she brings her millionaire son to his home. This is a story that will leave you speechless. What happens halfway through completely changes the ending. We'd love to know what city you're watching this video from. Let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our content. The sun had barely climbed over the worn rooftops of a modest neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, when Jamal Carter stepped out of his small two-bedroom apartment. At 28 years old, Jamal was a familiar face on these streets. Every morning he pedaled away on his old bicycle to start his shift as a package deliveryman for a local courier service. The neighborhood knew him for his quiet kindness and the way he always greeted everyone with a subtle nod or a warm good morning. That day was supposed to be just like any other. Jamal's family, his mother, Regina, and younger sister, Tiana, relied on his paycheck to keep the lights on and the rent paid. He had dreams, though. One day, he hoped to save enough money to open a small business, maybe a coffee shop or a community bookstore, something that could uplift the neighbors who often struggled. Those dreams felt distant and abstract as he started his deliveries. He knew the route by heart, past the old bodega, the abandoned lot where kids played ball, and the series of identical row houses lining the next few blocks. But something changed near the corner of Maple and 67th Street. Jamal froze at the intersection, his eyes catching a billow of thick, dark smoke rising against the blue sky. He watched it swirl, twisting its way upward. Shouts reached his ears, muffled and frantic. Instinct overrode everything else, and instead of continuing on his route, Jamal followed the smoke to a small, two-story home partially hidden by an old oak tree. The scene jolted him. The front door looked splintered, wisps of smoke escaping through its frame. He could hear a desperate cry inside. Without a second thought, he raced across the sidewalk, coughed as he inhaled the sooty air, and forced his way in. The heat from the flames lashed at his skin, the acrid odor stinging his eyes. "Help!" The voice was frail, gasping from somewhere upstairs. "I'm coming," Jamal called, his voice cracking. He navigated the burning house by sound alone. The black smoke pressed against his lungs. A beam from the ceiling collapsed just behind him as he dashed up the stairs. At the end of the hall, he found her, Mary Winston, an elderly woman with white hair disheveled, eyes brimming with terror. She clutched a walker, too frail and confused to escape on her own. Jamal scooped her into his arms and rushed back downstairs, dodging falling debris. Seconds later, he burst through the front door, carrying Mary into the open air. Neighbors watched in amazement as Jamal gently placed Mary on the grass, both of them coughing and wheezing. Her tearful gratitude washed over him, but before anyone could ask his name or praise his heroism, he slipped back onto his bicycle, anxious about being late for work. It was just another morning for Jamal, or so he believed. By evening, Jamal sat in his cramped living room, the sound of traffic drifting through the open window. He'd made it to work only slightly behind schedule. He said nothing about the fire. After all, what was there to say? He did what he hoped anyone would do. He hadn't told Regina or Tiana either. Regina, exhausted from a double shift at the school cafeteria, dozed off early. Tiana had been busy working on her college application essays, headphones on, barely aware when Jamal returned home. The next morning, as Jamal sipped a cup of oversweetened coffee, a knock at the door startled him. It was just past 9, and he had the day off because his manager insisted he rest after hearing about the fire. The neighborhood grapevine moved fast. Jamal set down his coffee and opened the door. Standing on the porch were two figures, Mary Winston, the same elderly woman he'd rescued, now leaning on a cane, and a tall, stern-looking man in a well-fitted suit beside her. Jamal's heart jumped. He tried to appear calm, but he was uncertain. Why had she come all the way here? You must be Jamal Carter, the man said in a low, resonant tone. My name is Richard Winston. This is my mother, Mary. You saved her life yesterday. Jamal nodded, speechless. He saw tears forming in Mary's eyes. She reached out and gently touched his hand. Thank you, she managed, her voice trembling. He ushered them inside, offering them the only comfortable seats he had, two mismatched armchairs with faded upholstery. Richard surveyed the modest interior, the peeling paint on the ceiling, the family photos on a single shelf, the worn carpet. There was no judgment in his gaze, just quiet observation. After a few moments, Richard began, My mother told me everything. About the fire, how you risked your own life to save hers. I wanted to meet you. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I know this is unusual, but I'd like to offer you something in return. Jamal blinked, surprised. I'm just glad she's safe, he said earnestly, his voice barely above a whisper. I understand. But please, hear me out. Richard leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I owe you a debt I can never repay. You saved my mother, and I'm grateful. He glanced at Mary, who nodded encouragement. I've been fortunate in life. I run a technology company, Winston Innovations. Perhaps you've heard of it. Jamal had, of course. Winston Innovations was always in the news, cutting-edge tech, massive valuations, and rumors about its reclusive billionaire founder, this very man sitting in his living room. I'd like to give you an opportunity, Richard continued, reaching into his jacket and pulling out an envelope. Consider it an investment in your future. $500,000 for you to start a business or do whatever you've dreamed of. And a position at Winston Innovations if you're interested. He laid the envelope gently on the coffee table. Jamal stared in disbelief. The room went silent. Mary smiled at him softly, urging him to accept. His mind whirled, $500,000. A job offer at a major corporation. He swallowed hard. This is too much, he said shakily. I didn't save your mother for a reward. Richard bowed his head. I know. That's why I want to help you. You're the kind of person I'd be proud to invest in. Let me do this. Jamal felt tears well in his eyes. This could change everything. He thought of his mother's weary face, Tiana's college dreams, the small business he'd always imagined. But it was overwhelming, almost frightening. Mary leaned forward and placed her hand over his. Accept this, Jamal. This is destiny. You've done something good. Let the world be good to you now. In a voice barely audible, Jamal nodded. He accepted. News traveled fast. Within a day, neighbors spoke of Jamal Carter and the mysterious billionaire who had visited him. Some claimed they saw an elegant black limousine parked outside his home. Others recounted that he was going to become the next great entrepreneur in the neighborhood. Whispers, rumors, and speculation filled the local barbershops and laundromats. Jamal, however, was lost in his own thoughts. He sat at the small wooden table in his kitchen, flipping through paperwork Richard's assistant had sent over. He had to choose how to use the funds, what kind of business to start, and how to adjust to the radical shift in his circumstances. Regina watched him with a weary pride. She had raised him to be humble and honest. Tiana sat opposite him, beaming with excitement. A bookstore, right? She asked eagerly. You always talked about opening a bookstore that would host community events, readings, maybe even a mentorship program for the kids who hang out on the block. Jamal smiled softly. Yes, something like that. But maybe with a small coffee bar, and computers for people who don't have internet access at home. A sort of community center disguised as a bookstore. He imagined the sign above the door, the shelves lined with stories waiting to be discovered, the laughter of customers feeling safe and welcomed. He also thought of the job at Winston Innovations. That could mean learning new skills, meeting influential people, ensuring long-term stability for his family. That afternoon, he met with Richard again, this time in the bright lobby of Winston Innovations' Manhattan headquarters. The building's towering glass facade reflected the city skyline. Inside, everything felt sleek and modern: polished floors, interactive displays in the reception area, and employees strolling in tailored suits. Richard introduced him to a few department heads, people who'd mentor him if he chose to join. Jamal admired the cutting-edge prototypes, the virtual reality workstations, the labs where engineers tinkered with drones and artificial intelligence devices. It was like stepping into the future, and he had a golden ticket to stay. They wrapped up the day in Richard's top-floor office, its windows overlooking the Hudson River. Richard explained his vision for Winston Innovations: technology that connected people, improved lives, and educated communities. Jamal saw sincerity in the billionaire's eyes and realized they shared a similar desire: to uplift others. As the sun set, Jamal walked out of the building feeling both exhilarated and uneasy. His life had changed overnight. He had to be careful and smart, to seize this moment without losing himself in the process. Little did he know that fate had much more in store: unexpected alliances, buried secrets, and challenges that would test not only his character but the very foundations upon which this new opportunity was built. A few weeks passed, and life began to settle into a surprising new normal. Jamal had resigned from his package delivery job and now balanced his days between planning his community bookstore cafe and attending orientation sessions at Winston Innovations. The first disbursement of Richard's investment had cleared into a special business account, and Jamal began scouting locations in the neighborhood, somewhere close enough that friends and neighbors could visit without feeling out of place. Still, a nagging feeling tugged at the back of his mind. The entire incident with Mary Winston and Richard's grand offer seemed too serendipitous. Fires break out in New York all the time, but this one led directly to his door. He tried to brush the doubts aside. After all, Mary had nearly died. What kind of person would stage something like that? Yet, as Jamal became more involved at Winston Innovations, he noticed small oddities. When he asked casual questions about Richard's family history, employees clammed up. The HR manager assigned to him, a woman named Carmen Lewis, looked almost relieved when he changed the subject. Another time, Jamal overheard two engineers whispering in the corridor about the old lady and the test. Before he could piece together their meaning, they noticed him and hurried away. Was he overthinking things? People gossiped at any company. But this was different. Everyone seemed wary, as if Jamal's presence had triggered silent alarms. Only Mary and Richard acted naturally, Mary beaming with pride, checking in by phone to ask how the business planning was going, Richard guiding Jamal through the basics of corporate finance, human resources, and strategy. They were generous and warm, yet their kindness now felt layered with something unspoken. One afternoon, Jamal sat at a small cafe near the Winston building, contemplating the storefront listings he'd pulled up on his laptop. He took a sip of his latte and tried to focus on finding the perfect location. But his eyes drifted to a newspaper article about local fires. Without intending to, he typed a quick search: "Fire at Winston Residence, Brooklyn." The result was sparse, just a small blurb mentioning a short-circuited power line. Nothing suspicious. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that he was missing a piece of the puzzle. Over the next week, Jamal's integration at Winston Innovations grew more complex. Richard introduced him to a group of senior executives in a sleek conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The executives were pleasant enough, but their smiles felt forced. They asked polite questions about his plans for the bookstore and listened to his answers with nods that seemed rehearsed. Richard tried to put him at ease. "It's a big change, I know," he said afterward, leading Jamal through a glass corridor that connected two wings of the building. "But I believe in you. You have the potential to connect with the community in ways we never could. That's what Winston Innovations needs." "Needs?" Jamal echoed, looking at the CEO's reflection in the polished glass. "Your company is successful. What could it possibly need from me?" Richard stopped, hands clasped behind his back. "Technology is only half the story. We build tools, yes, but how are we perceived? How do we bridge the gap between innovation and everyday lives? That's where you come in. You represent authenticity, community, hope. People trust someone who puts others first." Jamal nodded slowly. It sounded flattering, but he sensed a deeper meaning. Before he could probe further, Richard's phone buzzed. With an apologetic glance, he stepped aside to take the call. Alone in the corridor, Jamal looked down into the atrium below, where dozens of employees hustled about. Through another window, he saw a private lab where a group of technicians handled a sleek device. It looked like a drone, but more advanced, equipped with sensors and cameras. Something in the way they hovered over it, shielding it from view, struck him as secretive. On his way out, he spotted Carmen Lewis again. This time, he cornered her near the elevators. "Hey, Carmen. Can I ask you something?" he said, trying to sound casual. She looked up, startled. "Of course. How long have you worked here?" 10 years. She folded her arms. "I was here before the IPO, before the expansion." "Then you knew Mary Winston well?" Carmen's face tightened. "I know of her. She's the founder's mother, a lovely woman by all accounts. But she doesn't come around often. But she was just here, recently." Carmen paused, choosing her words. "Mary Winston is a private person. We respect that. Look, Jamal, I'm not sure what you're fishing for, but everyone here respects the family's privacy." The elevator arrived, and Carmen stepped inside, leaving Jamal standing in the hallway with more questions than answers. As the bookstore plans moved forward, Jamal found a promising location just a few blocks from his family's apartment. The building, once a small hardware store, had good bones. With a little renovation, it could host shelves of books, a coffee counter, and a modest stage area for readings and community events. The vision excited him: children's story hours, workshops for job seekers, and a safe haven for teens after school. He brought Richard and Mary to see it. Mary smiled as she touched the old wooden beams and imagined the laughter of children filling the space. Richard nodded approvingly, already making mental notes on how Winston Innovations could support digital learning programs there. Afterward, as Mary and Richard waited for their car, Mary squeezed Jamal's hand. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "You're making something beautiful here." "Thank you," he replied, looking into her kind eyes. For the first time in weeks, he felt the warmth of her gratitude and let himself believe that maybe everything was as it seemed. That night, he returned home to find his sister, Tiana, deep into her college applications. She was thrilled about the bookstore's potential, already brainstorming ways to incorporate career fairs and scholarship info sessions. Regina, their mother, watched them with quiet pride. The Carter home buzzed with optimism, a stark contrast to the lingering doubts in Jamal's mind. After everyone fell asleep, Jamal slipped out to the small backyard where he'd set up a makeshift desk. Under the glow of a dim porch light, he went through the paperwork Richard had given him. Among the documents was a folder detailing their mentorship plan. Winston Innovations would help with marketing, local outreach, even supply some tablets and e-readers. It all sounded too perfect. A stray photograph slipped from the folder. It showed Mary Winston as a young woman, standing beside a man who looked familiar. Jamal frowned, trying to place the face. He'd seen that grin before, framed in a family picture tucked away in a drawer. His father, Quincy Carter, who had passed away when Jamal was a child. The resemblance was unmistakable. Heart-pounding, Jamal pulled out the old family photograph from his drawer. His father, Quincy, in his 20s, smiling at a community cookout. In Mary's photograph, the man beside her wore the same crooked smile, the same kind eyes. Jamal realized, with a jolt, that he wasn't just imagining things. How did Mary Winston know his father? He needed answers. And he suspected that to get them, he'd have to push past the polite barriers and figure out what Mary and Richard had kept hidden. He felt the weight of a secret pressing down on him, a truth that might rewrite everything he believed about his past and future. The next morning, Jamal woke with a determination he hadn't felt before. He slipped into Winston Innovations early, flashing his new employee badge at security. If anyone questioned why he was in so early, he'd say he needed to review supplier contracts. Instead, he headed to the company archives, an expansive, climate-controlled room behind a frosted glass door where records dating back decades were stored. He searched for anything related to Mary Winston's past involvement in the company. After half an hour, he unearthed a small file marked Founders Photos. Within it, he found images of Mary Winston and her late husband, Harold Winston, the original founder. Among the photographs, a familiar face surfaced repeatedly: Jamal's father, Quincy Carter. Quincy Carter, smiling at a groundbreaking ceremony for the first Winston Innovations lab. Quincy Carter standing beside Mary, beaming as if they were old friends. The realization pummeled Jamal's heart. His father had once been close to the Winstons, yet Jamal's family had never spoken of it. Why? Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Jamal quickly returned the files and slipped out. But he wasn't fast enough. Carmen Lewis stood outside, eyeing him suspiciously. "Jamal, you're not authorized to be here," she said quietly. He swallowed, mustering courage. "Carmen, I need the truth." "My father, Quincy Carter, he knew Mary Winston, didn't he?" Carmen's eyes darted toward the security camera. She took him by the elbow and led him to a quiet stairwell. There, her voice dropped to a whisper. "Yes. They were close, many years ago. Your father worked with Harold Winston, and he was instrumental in the early success of the company's community initiatives. But he left abruptly, and afterward, his name was never mentioned." "Why?" Jamal demanded. "What happened?" Carmen hesitated, then sighed. "I only know fragments." Quincy was idealistic. He wanted Winston Innovations to remain community-focused, not just profit-driven. There were disagreements. He walked away, and no one ever explained why. But Mary never forgot him. Jamal's heart tightened. So this money, this opportunity, they're not just random acts of kindness, are they? Carmen shook her head slowly. "I don't think so. Mary must have recognized you. You look just like your father in those old photos." Jamal felt the hall spinning. He needed to confront Mary and Richard, to peel away this facade. But before he could, Carmen grabbed his hand. "Be gentle with them. They might have their reasons, and not all secrets are cruel. Sometimes people hide the truth to protect those they love." That evening, Jamal called Mary and Richard and asked to meet them at the under-renovation bookstore. The space was hollow and echoing under dim construction lights. A few shelves were up, and the smell of fresh paint lingered in the air. Mary arrived first, leaning on her cane but walking more steadily than before. Richard followed, looking concerned. They stood among the half-installed fixtures, their silhouettes casting long shadows. "Jamal, what's this about?" Richard asked, crossing his arms. Jamal held up the photograph he'd found in his family's drawer, the one of his father at the community cookout. You knew my father, he said, voice trembling. You both did. Why didn't you tell me? Mary's eyes widened, tears gathering at the corners. I was going to tell you, she said softly. I just wanted to be sure you were ready. Richard looked down, as if ashamed. Your father meant a great deal to my parents, he began. He and my father were best friends in college. After the company started to grow, Quincy helped shape its early mission. He pushed for outreach programs, scholarships, technology labs in underfunded schools. He believed wealth should serve the community. Mary stepped forward, her cane tapping softly against the floor. When the company took a more profit-oriented turn, Quincy felt betrayed. He left, refusing to be part of what he saw as corporate greed. We tried to reach out, but he wouldn't return our calls. He chose to raise his family on his own terms, away from the Winstons. Jamal's eyes filled with tears. You could have told me from the start. Why test me? Why the fire, the money, the job? Mary's shoulders sagged. I never planned the fire, my dear, she said. That was an accident, a terrible one. But when you saved me, I saw Quincy's spirit in you, the bravery, the selflessness. I realized fate had brought us together. I wanted to give you what your father fought for, a company that truly cared. I wanted you to guide us back to that vision. Richard added quietly, we feared you might reject us if we revealed the truth too soon. We worried you'd think we were using you, or you'd resent the past. We wanted you to see our intentions, our gratitude, without the weight of old wounds. Jamal wiped his face, caught between anger and empathy. They had hidden so much. But he also saw their remorse and hope. You should have trusted me, he said, voice raw. My father raised me to be honest and compassionate. Don't you think I would have understood? Mary reached for his hand, eyes shining. I'm sorry, Jamal. You're right. We should have told you from the start. Please forgive us. Your father's dream was never fulfilled. With your help, maybe we can finally do that. In the days that followed, a fragile peace formed between Jamal and the Winstons. He learned more about his father's work at Winston Innovations, the community grants he initiated, the youth training programs that once flourished. Over time, those programs had faded away. Harold Winston had passed, and Richard, young and eager to prove himself, focused on innovation and market dominance, losing sight of the original mission. Mary had grown distant, mourning her husband and the loss of the company's philanthropic heart. She rarely visited the offices, preferring a quiet life. The fire forced her out of solitude and into Jamal's path, sparking a second chance for everyone involved. Now that the truth was out, Richard offered Jamal a real role, more than just a face of goodwill. He wanted Jamal to lead a new division dedicated to social impact, investing in small businesses, improving digital literacy in underprivileged neighborhoods, and forging partnerships with local schools. Working side by side, they found unexpected harmony. Richard, once distant and aloof, revealed a humble willingness to learn. Jamal, who initially doubted the corporate world, discovered that big companies could create massive positive change if guided by the right principles. Meanwhile, the bookstore cafe took shape. The shelves began to fill with donated titles, and Winston Innovations promised a steady supply of e-readers and tablets. Local artists volunteered to paint murals on the walls. The community buzzed with anticipation. Jamal and Tiana planned a grand opening event featuring storytelling sessions, poetry readings, and a job fair. Regina watched it all with tears of pride. Her late husband's ideals were coming full circle through their son. The money and prestige mattered less now. What mattered was the unity and purpose they had rediscovered. On a crisp Saturday morning, the grand opening of Jamal's bookstore cafe, named Carter's Corner, drew a crowd. Neighbors, friends, and curious passers-by gathered outside, chatting excitedly. A new mural on the side wall depicted Quincy Carter and Harold Winston shaking hands beneath an oak tree, a symbol of partnership and shared dreams. Mary Winston, elegant in a warm coat, cut the ribbon with Jamal at her side. Richard and Tiana helped organize the guests. The first visitors stepped in and gasped at the bright, welcoming space. Shelves overflowed with literature, from classics to children's stories. A corner station offered free internet access. A small coffee bar served affordable drinks and pastries. Volunteers signed people up for literacy classes and workshops. As sunlight streamed through the front windows, Jamal saw Mary standing quietly by the poetry section, tears on her cheeks. He approached and gently placed an arm around her shoulders. "He would be proud," she said, smiling up at him. "Your father would be so proud of you." Jamal's eyes misted. "I think he'd be proud of all of us." Richard stepped forward, holding a small plaque. Engraved on it were the words, "In honor of Quincy Carter, whose vision of compassion guides us still." Jamal took it and placed it prominently near the entrance. A hush fell over the crowd as people read the inscription and understood that this place was more than just a store, it was a living legacy. In that moment, Jamal realized how far they had come. The twist of fate that began with a fire and an impossible rescue had led him to uncover old family ties and rekindle a lost idealism. He understood now that Mary and Richard's secrecy had been born of fear and regret, not malice. They had needed him as much as he needed them. As customers browsed and children laughed, as community leaders shook hands with corporate executives, as old wounds healed under the promise of a better future, Jamal felt at peace. He had found his purpose, bridging worlds, honoring the past, and carving a path forward where compassion and innovation walked hand in hand. Epilogue, New beginnings. Months later, Carter's Corner thrived as a cultural hub. Winston Innovations launched a formal community impact division under Jamal's leadership, funding educational programs and small enterprises in neighborhoods like his. The media praised the transformation, calling it a new era of corporate ethics. On a quiet afternoon, Jamal sat at a small table by the window, sipping coffee and helping a young student pick out a book for a school project. Outside, the street bustled with life. He glanced at a framed photograph behind the register, his father and Harold Winston laughing under the summer sun, and smiled. What began as a harrowing rescue from flames had become a story of reconciliation and hope. Jamal Carter had stepped into a destiny shaped by courage, community, and forgiveness. And with each page turned, each neighbor helped, each dream supported, he honored the legacy of those who came before and kindled a brighter future for all.